So in this video, I'm going to be talking about how clusters store information in Veracrypt. A cluster is the smallest amount of disk space that can be allocated to hold a file, any file, no matter how big or small. And two files, no matter how small, cannot occupy the same cluster. The only thing that can be on a cluster is one single file that is smaller or the exact same size as the cluster itself, or the smaller parts of a larger file that requires the space of two or more clusters. And when you format a volume in Veracrypt, you need to designate the cluster size when you format it. And when you have a file, even if that file only has one bit of information, it's still going on and taking up a cluster on the hard disk in the size that you designate when you first format the drive. So when I go here and I create a volume, I create it with a cluster size of a certain size. 0.5 kibibytes, 1 kibibyte, 2 kibibyte, 4 kibibyte, so on and so forth, right? So if I create a file, if I create an encrypted file folder, say of 0 kibibytes, which I have done over here, let's take a look at this. So I've created a cluster size, an example cluster size, and I have three written documents. Now, if I go here and I take a look at properties, you'll see that it's 511 bytes, precisely 511 bytes. And the size on the disk is 512 bytes, or 0.5 kibibytes. So the size, it's less than the size of one cluster, which is 512 bytes. But even though it's less than the size of the cluster, it's still taking up the cluster. Now, if I take a look at this one, I am precisely 512 bytes. I am no space is wasted. I am precisely 512 bytes. Precisely and exactly, and the size on the disk is the cluster size, 512 bytes. However, if I go to cluster test 3 and I open it up, I open it up, it's 513 bytes. However, the size on the disk is 1024 bytes. So 1024 bytes. So one full kibibyte. Now, what's going on here is that even if I'm 1 byte of information over, that means I need 2 clusters, 2 full clusters. So if I have one cluster that is under or precisely at 512 bytes, or the size of the cluster, even if I'm 1 byte over that cluster, I need 2 clusters. And so this file is bigger than the cluster, and so it requires 2 clusters. However, if you have a bunch of files that you know for a fact are going to be over 64 kibibytes, then that's what you're going to want. You're going to want to format your file, format your drive, format your volume in a kibibyte, in a cluster size that makes sense. You don't want to format a drive in 0.5 kibibytes and just have all your files be enormous. 0.5 kibibytes is really good if your files are really, really small, because it takes up, it wastes less space than if you were 64 kibibytes. If this was 64 kibibytes and I formatted the drive, my file here of 511 bytes would take up 64 bytes of cluster size. And so that would be an enormous amount of wasted space. So yeah, so that's just my rundown of how clusters store information in Veracrypt. I hope that makes some sense. Anyway, if you guys like this video, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and help the channel out. Appreciate you.